Hello and welcome to this Future Apprenticeship recorded webinar. The topic of today's session is delivering apprenticeship standards in customer service as part of the Future Apprenticeship programme. My name is Zoe Bolger, I'm on the right there from Strategic Development Network, and joining me today to take you through the session is Carol Loader. Carol has 25 years experience in delivering apprenticeship provision and quality assurance, and if you'd like to introduce yourself, Carol, I'll pass you over to you now to take you through the presentation.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you for that. So yes, this is we're now coming to the final stage of the Future Apprenticeship Support Programme. Over the years, there's been quite a number of different aspects of support that's been delivered, including employer engagement and business development groups, organisational action planning and change management groups, provider readiness groups, information sharing, and also action planning groups for new apprenticeship standards. In addition to that, obviously, the well-known toolkit, the Future Apprenticeship Support Toolkit, which is still available. So moving on, the outputs for today are specifically to understand the difference between delivering frameworks and standards, and we're going to focus on a particular standard today. Also to aid discussions and decisions around how you want to implement specific standards in your organisation, and also how you're going to select those for delivery. Considering what good apprenticeship delivery and on-programme assessment may look like. Understanding the implications of endpoint assessment for on-programme delivery. Considering quality improvement measures, and also signposting you to useful tools. And this is one of the useful tools I want to draw your attention to. As I've said, it's the Future Apprenticeship Provider Toolkit. There's an awful lot of resources on there that are still useful for those of you that are transitioning across from frameworks to standard. Examples of some of those tools, for example, are transition planning documents or maybe confidence checklists to help with your staff CPD. So at the end of the session, we'll provide you with links where you can gain access to these. And over the past few years, as we've been delivering the Future Apprenticeship Programme, no doubt some of you that are listening to this recording today, we may have met. And it's been really great to support all of you and to gain thoughts as we've been developing through the apprenticeship reforms. So today we're going to specifically focus on two standards. We're going to focus on Customer Service Practitioner, which is a Level 2 standard. Now that standard actually was approved for delivery in July 2006. It only seems like yesterday, but it was actually in 2016, sorry. And that standard is typically of a duration of around about 12 months. So apprentices on this programme are specifically on programme for around about 12 months. And the core responsibility for these apprentices is to provide a high quality service to customers, which can be delivered in the workplace, digitally, or through going out into customers' own localities. And these may be a one-off or routine contacts, and they may include dealing with things like orders, payments, offering advice and guidance and support, meeting and greeting, for example, maybe sales or fixing problems. So within the standard itself, it does give you a really good description of the parameters really for that particular standard. The Customer Service Specialist, which actually is a Level 3, you will be very pleased to know that this has just been approved in May 2018. The duration for this particular standard is around about, it's saying 15 months. But there's one thing I'd like to draw your attention to. For those of you that are actually looking at this particular assessment plan now that's been approved, just a little note, there's been an update. There was an update on the May version. And they have reissued a new version of the assessment plan. The first one that they published was wrong. So if you actually go onto the system, you'll notice right at the bottom of the page on the Institute for Apprenticeship website that there is a little version update there, and you can gain access to the new one. So if you are actually listening to this webinar in June 2018, then just please make sure that you've been back onto the site and gained the correct document. So in terms of customer service specialist, the main purpose of this particular professional standard is for direct customer support with all sectors and organisation types. And the apprentice, for example, should be an advocate of customer service and act as a referral point for maybe dealing with more complex or technical customer requests, for example, complaints and queries. So again, you can actually go on to the Institute for Apprenticeship website and you can pull down the standard and it gives you that good descriptor for this particular role. So it's great actually to see that's been now released. So there's been quite a lot of investment in time from the employer groups that have helped to develop this standard. And some of those employer groups, for example, are Boots UK, Institute for Customer Service, Berkeley Homes Limited, the British Council, British Gas, Carillion, Northern Power Grid, etc., etc. So there's been a number of organisations involved in the development of this particular standard. So just moving forward on to the bandings for these particular awards. So what you have specifically for your customer service practitioner is a band 6 and also for the specialist as well. So they're relating to sort of May funding opportunities, and again you can go on to the relevant government websites to establish the current banding for these. So it's always really useful to continually go back to the government websites just in case something has changed. When we move on and start to look at the difference between apprenticeship frameworks and apprenticeship standards, for example, what you can see on screen here is essentially a visual of the SACE framework being typically you would have a learner who would do initial assessment, make sure that they're on the right program, and then there would be a period of on and off the job training. And that period of on and off the job training would include your mandatory qualifications, maths and English, personal learning and thinking skills, employers' rights and responsibilities. And as you work through that period of on and off the job training and assessment, you would typically have had or will have still an assessor who would work towards the criteria of a vocational qualification, and they would assess competence throughout the whole programme. That would then lead to completion of a certificate, and then essentially once all of that qualification and framework is achieved, you would then be deemed as occupationally competent. So what does it look like when you look at standards? So let's take a quick view. So first of all, one of the significant differences is that the design and the contract right at the beginning of the programme is really essential. We've moved across from a contract and funding learner funding and qualification funding regime into the new apprenticeship reforms and the levy, and also that has brought about a commercial environment. So as a provider, it's really up to you as a provider to actually work out how much you want to charge for your services, and also negotiate that with the employer as well. So there's a lot of contract and negotiation right at the beginning. And then moving on, you still have the aspect of initial assessment. And then I think the significant difference really between what was the current on and off the job training and the new area and period of on programme is this element here, which is the gateway. So essentially what you have is within the context of the 12-month programme for customer service practitioner or 15-month programme for customer service specialist, you have a dedicated period of time there where you will train learners and you will teach learners the skills, knowledge and behaviour of the specific standards that they have chosen that they are working towards. And actually the formal assessment of that actually doesn't come into play until they actually pass what's called a gateway, and then they are independently assessed. So the endpoint assessment for customer service practitioner and specialist will walk through the requirements of that in a moment. But there's a definite distinction between the on-the-job training and teaching and learning and program, and essentially all of that skills, knowledge and behaviours development, preparing the learner for Gateway, and then once actually that learner has been deemed as eligible for Gateway, they would move into an independent endpoint assessment, and we're going to cover a little bit about endpoint shortly. So essentially, you know, what has changed? And I think that it's probably important to say that I think that's one of the significant elements, which is this independent endpoint assessment, which happens at the end of the teaching and learning period. I think when designing the curriculum around this also, in some of the standards, and in particular, you know, customer service practitioner may be one of them, it's not specifically written into that standard about things like equality and diversity in its widest sense, in the sense that we know it. So when you are developing your curriculum around customer service practitioner and specialist, it's really important that there's a few things that you don't forget about. One of those obviously is making sure that you have a safe worker and a safe learner. So embedding all of those safety aspects into the program, into the curriculum, you know, early doors actually, you know, can make sure that the learner is safe in the working and learning environment that they're in. In addition to that, obviously, there's the maths and English element. And in particular, in customer service practitioner, a learner actually has to achieve a level 1 English and maths, and they have to at least attempt the level 2 test. Slightly different in customer service specialist, where they have to actually achieve the level 2 maths and English. So really embedding the maths and English element in that on and off the job training is still paramount as part of the delivery. And then in addition to that, from a wider aspect, we can't really forget about the equality and diversity aspect. And the customer service standards, for example, in particular the practitioner asks that apprentices treat all customers as individuals, and they don't forget the wider aspects of this in terms of actually, as part of the Common Inspection Framework, we still, as providers, have a requirement to ensure that learners' awareness of equality, diversity, employers' rights, British values, for example, are all embedded as part of the curriculum. So we have to take the standard, the skills, knowledge and behaviour of the standard, and then let's just overlay those really good things that we already do on the equality, diversity, British values, prevent side, as well as the maths and English, and layer those over the top. Within the actual Common Inspection Framework itself, it does actually talk about good providers having staff that are skilled at challenging stereotypical behaviour, that they use and challenge anybody that's using derogatory language, and that they promote quality and equality of opportunity and diversity in all of their teaching practice. So regardless of actually whether it's written within the skills, knowledge and behaviours in an explicit form, I would still encourage providers to actually, you know, take examples from the Common Inspection Framework and make that an inherent part of delivery. So now it's important to stress that customer service framework as well as standards are currently in delivery. And the last time I looked at the apprenticeship framework delivery list, which was May 2018, there was no listed withdrawal date for customer service level 2 or level 3 frameworks. And I'll say yet, because obviously over the course of the last few months, up to now, there's been around about 80 frameworks that have had published withdrawal dates. So please, you know, keep an eye on those withdrawal dates. So just moving further into, obviously, once the endpoint assessment has been completed, if the learner achieves that and passes that, whether that be at pass or distinction level, once they've actually gone through that, they will then receive and be classed as occupationally competent. So I think it's just to refresh, it's the significance really around the endpoint assessment that's important for me. So if I was to take two go-to documents, the two documents that I would look at, first of all, would be the standard. And you can see there on screen the sort of really good explanation and overview of, for example, the customer service specialist and that particular role. The standard itself describes the skills, knowledge, behaviours. It also includes mandated elements such as maybe entry requirements, links to professional bodies, specifies the level of the standard as well, which is really important, and the duration of the standard. And the second go-to document, which is essential, is the assessment plan. And it's this assessment plan that the endpoint assessment organisations and the endpoint assessors actually use as their guide on specifically how assessment should be carried out, how endpoint assessment should be carried out. So it explains what will be assessed, how the apprentice will be assessed. It indicates who will carry this out, and the competency and the grading of that, and also proposes internal and external quality assurance arrangements. So it's really important to see, even though you do have customer service practitioner and customer service specialist, is maybe not to assume that for all they've been developed by the same group that they're identical and the requirements are identical, because there are little subtle differences between the two. So moving on into the apprentice journey. So let's have a look first of all at information, advice and guidance and initial assessment, and what good looks like specifically coming from providers. So utilising a range of initial assessment methods to engage and assess, for example, behaviours, aptitude, motivation, maths and English, is really useful, and many providers over the past few months have really been starting to look at what they use in terms of tools for initial assessment. And certainly quite a number of providers have been looking at developing skill scans of how to identify gaps in any previous experience, so that they can make sure that the contracting with the employer is fit for purpose for the employer as well as the learner, and also to highlight any opportunities for on and off the job training. And this should be really key, a key document really, or certainly the initial assessment should be key to understanding exactly what skills, knowledge and behaviours for that particular learners and for those particular employers need to be developed. And also, in addition to that, taking time to discuss and record career goals. So is the learner actually on the right programme? And in particular with customer service standards. I've been in the industry sort of just over 25 years. And I think customer service is specifically been one of those frameworks in the past that it's been used as a sort of one size fits all. If another framework hasn't actually fit the job role, then potentially, do business development teams push in customer service as an alternative. And I think that that was always on the concept that every particular environment has customers, whether it be internal or external, and sometimes that leads to actually learners being on the wrong program, apprenticeship program. So I think it's about maybe professionalising the customer service practitioner and customer service specialist roles, and really making sure that those learners have every opportunity to demonstrate the skills, knowledge and behaviours, and that they can exceed and excel to distinction level, wherever possible. So just making sure it's used in a fit for purpose way. In terms of the on-programme training and what good looks like, building close collaboration between employers and apprentices to agree sequencing of training and setting realistic and challenging timescales. So what opportunities are you providing to discuss and negotiate the training plans with employers? How are you getting them involved in training? What does the employer do, for example, during induction that could be cross-referenced into the scheme of work for that particular learner or that group of learners? Stretching apprentices to improve their capabilities both up to and beyond what's in the standard, and keeping an eye on grade profiles and aim to understand what your apprentices are capable of right from the beginning. When you do your initial assessment, when you look at that, actually, is that learner, do you think, capable of reaching distinction level? How do you know what potentially your profile might look like, and how are you going to get that information? Teach apprentices increasingly complex skills to prepare them for higher levels and also for job progression. So just because the qualification might not be delivered doesn't mean assessment goes the journey. So you'll notice when we go through the standard, actually in customer service practitioner and customer service specialist, there's no mandated qualification as part of these particular standards. But just because there isn't a particular qualification doesn't necessarily mean that you can't put training courses on and modules that really stretch that learner and maybe prepare them for their next steps. So how do you know actually that you are preparing them for next steps, and how are you actually, regardless of whether you're delivering a qualification, understand that that particular learner has been rigorously assessed, that they've been given really good feedback, and that feedback is allowing them to constantly improve how well they do their job at work. Moving on, also embedding rigorous assessment, obviously, as I've said, making sure that their achievements are recognised, and also that that feedback is really really strong and really worthwhile and constructive. And then looking obviously at maths and English, so continually embedding this maths and English, and reinforcing and focusing on, even though potentially a learner may come with their level 1 maths and English or their level 2 maths and English, is just continue to stretch throughout the programme, continue to look at that, because it is well known that learners actually do over time potentially lose for example, their maths and English skills, their punctuation might slip. It's really important to, as part of the programme, that anybody who is training the learner or working with the learner can actually really give good feedback on their level of maths and English. And also identifying qualified staff, and those qualified staff being able to assess the apprentices' maths and English. So I'd suppose ask yourself the question, the staff that you have, actually, are they first and foremost, assessors and trainers, and you've attached maybe the maths and English delivery, or do you have dedicated staff who can maybe support those learners that can't work independently or can't work just on a virtual resource and really do need the support? And how, within the context of what you do with customer service, do you actually negotiate with the employer and get them to commit to the apprentice studying their English and maths in addition to their 20% requirement of off-the-job training? So that's quite a lot of teaching and learning time, quite a lot of off-the-job time. How do you actually really support your learners in the maths and English and make sure that they get that time dedicated that they need? And then moving on into building on the results of initial assessment, and as a result of apprentices seeing the value of and build their skills in line with their career objectives. So really understanding that in a customer service world, this is somebody who actually wants to excel in a customer service environment. Going back, some of you that have actually been on the Future Apprenticeship Support Programmes before will have seen this slide in various formats, and this is just an overview of an analysis that was specifically done around Ofsted reports. And as you can see here on the left-hand side, these are all potentially the judgments or indicators that might push a grade up in terms of good or better. And not surprisingly, on the right-hand side, things like lack of targets, sessions not being very well planned, limited feedback or unstructured feedback, for example, are all of those aspects and judgments that were commonly seen in the reports that were either requires improvement or worse. And we've just recently done a new analysis on that. It'll be published shortly via webinar. And essentially, within the context of this, when you look at the reports today, very little's changed. And I think if you were to, cast your mind 12 months on, I think what you would actually see again is that these would be the things and the ingredients that would make either a successful provider or a provider that maybe is failing in their provision. So when we look at the role of endpoint assessment, so I suppose it's important to reflect back on the initial diagram that we had. So this is essentially a new part to the apprenticeship programs, as we know. And the role of the endpoint assessment organisation is to conduct synoptic and independent endpoint assessment, to adhere to specific arrangements of the criteria set out in this assessment plan, and that's pretty crucial. To quality assure their endpoint assessments that they deliver, and also to identify and record when apprentices has passed the endpoint assessment. And finally, to adhere to any external quality assurance requirements. Now, in the concept of customer service practitioner, there is currently, as at June 2018, around about 14 endpoint assessment organisations. So there's a range of those, and at the moment for specialist there isn't anybody that's been published as approved yet for delivery, but I think it's probably fair to say that that will change significantly over the next few months, and we'll probably see round about the same number, if not more, that we've got on customer service practitioner. So looking at the requirements of assessment organisations, so endpoint assessment organisations, these are the things that they must do. So they must have relevant occupational expertise for the specific standard in terms of customer service practitioner and specialist. They must have relevant assessment expertise. They must robustly manage conflicts of interest and provide quality assurance of their activity. And the assessment plan specifically said that independent assessors must meet the following criteria. So they must understand the customer service sector and of the role covered by the apprentice. They must be occupationally competent of 2 years or more, and with no direct relationship with the apprentice, the employer or the training provider. That's where your independence comes from. They must also hold or be working towards a qualification undertaking specifically around assessment and verification activity. And there's examples of what that particular qualification might be or their equivalents when you read the assessment plan. And very similar in terms of any internal quality assurance that the endpoint assessment organisations have, they must be appropriately qualified, and the person who's doing the internal quality assurance must not have been involved in any aspect of delivery of assessment of the programme they are quality assuring. So this is where you can see, a definite distinction between what we would currently know in terms of our current assessment and IQA under frameworks world, moving over to the endpoint assessment in standards world and the independence that's really important within that. And also in terms of an endpoint assessment, cannot deliver any learning elements to the same apprentice or deliver endpoint assessments to non-apprentices. So endpoint assessment, that term, that activity, only specifically relates to apprenticeship provision. It doesn't relate, for example, to adult education budget. So let's take a quick look at customer service practitioner and the assessment methods. So the first method of three is an apprenticeship showcase, has a weighting of 65%. It's got to take place after a minimum of 12 months on programme. There's no surprise there, because 12 months is the minimum duration for apprenticeships under the funding rules. They've got to complete and achieve all of the pass criteria. And if they are to actually achieve a distinction, they must meet the pass criteria and at least 70% of the distinction criteria. So within the context of this, then just a few little points. The apprenticeships showcase is compiled obviously after the 12 months. And this must be a reflection. It's an opportunity for the learner to reflect and present examples of their work. It may be delivered virtually. So if you do find that your endpoint assessment organisation is using a virtual method, then I would suggest that the apprentice actually needs to be trained in that technology so that they feel confident using the technology. I would also ask your endpoint assessment organisation if you can have a copy, for example, of the external brief. So there's got to be an external brief that comes with the apprenticeship showcase. So, ask if you can have copies of that so that you know how to prepare your learners for the showcase. And the showcase may include things like work-based evidence. It could be customer feedback, recordings. It also could be things like witness testimonies and statements, reviews and managers' reviews and performance appraisals. We then work through to practical observation. This is our second assessment method. It's worth 20% of the weighting. It's a minimum of 1 hour observation. So there's key there, I think, minimum of 1 hour. If you were to ask your endpoint assessment organisation, have they applied a maximum to that so that you can work within your boundaries when you're preparing your learner. Again, it's 100% of all pass criteria. And on this, to get a distinction on practical observation, they have to meet at least 80% of the distinction criteria. So within the context of this, you should expect that this is a pre-planned and scheduled activity, and it should be at the apprentice's normal place of work. And each situation within the observation will be different. For example, it may be things like handling a general inquiry, it could be dealing with customer complaints, or maybe a need for further information or detail that the apprentice has to go and explore. But it's mandatory that the observation covers a minimum of presentation, equality, interpersonal skills, communication, and personal goals. And you'll find all of this information in the assessment plan. And last but not least, professional discussion, which is worth 15%. It lasts for a maximum of 1 hour. And also very similar sort of grading structure between pass and distinction. You've got to meet all of the pass criteria to achieve a pass, and 75% of the distinction criteria if you want to achieve a distinction. So those areas of the standard which are not able to be evidenced during observation, for example, will be discussed subsequently at professional discussion by the independent endpoint assessor. So the professional discussion obviously lasts for a maximum of 1 hour. So it's really important that you work with the learner to ensure they are very well prepared, they are confident, and they can answer questions and have a discussion about the precise criteria that you need them to cover. So it's really important to keep on topic. The last thing that you want is to find out that you're on 60 minutes, you've got potentially a 10% contingency that you are going to end up going over that particular requirement, and the endpoint assessor hasn't really had the full amount of time to be able to draw out the information and to have that discussion with the learner. So make sure that they keep on topic. So obviously from this you'll see that it is just 2 grading criteria. Obviously we do have fail, so fail, pass, distinction. There's no merit in the customer service practitioner. And if any part of the assessment isn't sufficient when it's first submitted, there is opportunities for resubmission or re-observation or redoing the professional discussion. These things can be repeated, but the assessment plan specifically says that, however, they don't expect this to be lots of times. It says multiple assessment opportunities essentially are not expected. So that's potentially saying that you couldn't have multiple, but it's saying that they're not expected, so it shouldn't become the norm. and refer to your endpoint assessment organisation and ask them what is their reset policies in terms of costs and also timeframes as well. That's a really important question to ask. So when we work through this, you'll have noticed that I've been talking about of the pass criteria and 70% of the distinction criteria. So I'm just going to show you what that looks like in the assessment plan. So what you can see here is the Customer Service Practitioner Assessment Plan. It has the standard, so the skills, knowledge and behaviours are in the annex. It also specifically says in easy, really precise way what the learner and apprentice needs to do, and then it gives you your pass criteria and distinction criteria. And the thing I like about this actually is the assessment plan definition as well. It says this is the method of assessment. So what you can do when you're preparing your learners is actually really pull out those activities that potentially, for example, are relating to professional discussion, and really make sure that your learners hone their skills in being able to have that really concise discussion with the independent endpoint assessor, as well as the opposite side, obviously, observation, for example. Make sure that anything that is assessment method of observation, that your apprentice absolutely maximises the time that they have within the system. And it might not be unusual actually for your endpoint assessor, if they've seen enough, is actually to prompt the learner and say, I've seen enough now, and allow the learner to move on. But you really do have to take guidance from the endpoint assessment organisation as to what their protocols are for assessment practice. So moving forward into the customer service specialist. So you do have practical observation. This one's slightly different. It's with Q&As, and I think there's very much an assumption that in the frameworks world, when we've been observing, it's not unusual actually for you as an assessor maybe to ask questions as you're working with that learner. And the assessment methods in endpoint assessment is quite specific. Observation is observation. And if you then suddenly go out and start asking lots and lots of questions as an endpoint assessor, then you're taking up that time, that crucial time for that learner to be able to showcase their observation to you. So within the practitioner assessment plan, what it says is if there are gaps from observation, then you can pick it up in professional discussion. However, in customer service specialist, the method is practical observation with Q&A. So what that specifically says is you can ask those questions as you are working through. But it specifically also says that this should not exceed 15% of the total time allowed for the practical observation. So the endpoint assessor really needs to judge that time and make sure that your apprentices have plenty of time to showcase their work. So it has to be done within 3 months of the start date, lasting 1 hour with a 10% tolerance. And this is pass, fail, pass and distinction as well. So the observations covered in one session. It should involve activities which allow the apprentice to demonstrate that full range of knowledge, skills and behaviours, and really refer to your annex around your grading and your criteria to make sure that you can help learners focus on those methods. They also should take place in the apprentice's workplace, and apprentices must be given at least 2 weeks' notice of the practical observation. So the observations can be, for example, before or after they submit a work-based project, but it's recommended that the observation essentially is not before the professional discussion. So it's very interesting to see the differences between customer service practitioner and customer service specialist in this particular observation method, one with Q&A and one without. And then there's a work-based project completed within 2 months from the start of endpoint. There's an interview that will take place before the end of 3 months endpoint assessment period. There's a word count on this as well, a 2,500 word count on a written report. So the apprentice needs to submit this report specifically on the project that they've carried out to their endpoint assessor, and there's a time frame on that. It's 2 weeks before the specific interview date. The date will be agreed, and the apprentice essentially will be interviewed, and the report, for example, should contain things like emails. Examples of evidence could be emails, letters, meeting notes, call logs, workflow documents. So any supporting evidence of the project should be compiled within an annex of the learner's report. And although there's flexibility in the order of the assessments, it's recommended that the written work-based project takes place before the professional discussion. So again, there's a fail-pass distinction on that. And then last but not least, the professional discussion supported by portfolio evidence. So this is based around a interview. It again has a tolerance of 10% either way. The interview will focus on a written project. It also could be virtually. So again, like customer service practitioner, if your endpoint assessment organisation is going to use a virtual technology, is just make sure that your learner is confident at actually using that technology. And again, with the same is, make sure that you speak to your endpoint assessment organisation around resets. And it does actually state within the plan also that the interview will consist of competency-based questions. And specifically, this is around like 10-point questions that they talk about. It's quite specific. May be useful just to ask your endpoint assessment organisation, do they have any mock test papers ready? Is there anything there that you can look at which might help you prepare your learners for endpoint? And again, with the previous assessment plan, you also have an annex which is quite specific. It says what your learners have to do in terms of what they must know and the methods in which are going to be used by the independent endpoint assessor. And again, there's quite specific grading criteria. So what you can see on screen now is an example from the practical observation session. So you can see the criteria for a fail shows a little or no understanding of their roles in meetings and organisations' customer service, right through to distinction, demonstrate known communication with customers, ensuring the best solution to meet customers' requirements and needs. So these documents will be very much the go-to documents for your endpoint assessors. So suggestion during delivery, you may want to look at those as well as a key crucial element to the prep work. So within the context of this, the fail, pass and merit grades are awarded at endpoint. And if an apprentice fails any part of the endpoint assessment methods, then it's a fail. In terms of resets, it basically specifies that if the apprentice fails any part of the endpoint, further development must be provided prior to a reset or retake. There's no specific mention here of the multiple times as there is in practitioner. So there's no limit to the number of retake or resets, but it's got to be within a time frame. So it says within a 12-month period. So that's quite interesting to see the differences between those two standards. So let's look at preparing for endpoint assessment. So these are some of the things that I would potentially be asking myself. I would challenge you to ask yourself, at what stage during the journey are you introducing dimensions of endpoint assessment? Over the course of the past few years, we've had a variety of different methods come through from training providers. Some have said that they'll introduce them right from the beginning. Others have said what they'll do is they'll primarily concentrate on teaching and learning of the skills, knowledge and behaviours in the first 2/3 of the programme, and then really strongly introduce endpoint preparation in the last third of the programme on programme before gateway. So I think it really just depends on what suits your particular employer and learners. When will you build into the programme assessment of knowledge, skills and behaviours? And at what point will they be graded? So do you intend to actually start looking at specifically what the grading criteria is? How do you actually intend to actually build in those challenges to distinction when you start writing your courses, when you start writing your materials? And a number of providers that I've worked with over the past few years and in future apprenticeship support programs have talked about having modules or courses or workbooks, and then within those workbooks they specifically specifying, if you want to be a distinction, this is what you have to do to reach that particular accolade or grade. And then what training resources and materials will you use to capture these opportunities, and what assessment methods will you actually use for each of them? So yes, I'm sure that observation will still be very, very key as part of the whole programme, but at what point potentially are you going to maybe introduce that element of independence? So some organisations have actually had their trainer assessor work with those learners on programme, and then closer to the end, near a gateway, they've introduced a third person to the team who's the learner doesn't know, and they've almost done sort of a mock endpoint assessment. They've come in and sort of done an independent observation so that the learner experiences what it's like to work with somebody and showcase their skills to somebody that they don't know. And then moving on is how have you or will you mitigate the risk against teaching to test? So if you know what those assessment instruments are, how will you make sure that your core curriculum actually covers all of the skills, knowledge and behaviours and extends and challenges that learner through into the higher levels of grading? Or are you just going to try and establish specifically what is in those instruments that the endpoint assessment organisations have got and follow those as a guide? And I would always lean towards actually using the standard itself as the core document. Make sure that the learner knows everything, and then whatever is thrown at them in terms of their endpoint assessment, they should feel confident that they can demonstrate their skills to meet the standard. Because remember, to pass, you've got to pass all criteria. It's not just some, it's all of that. So we're also going to look at quality assurance and some aspects and considerations. So as you can see here, what you have is an overall approach to quality assurance. I don't really think has altered as a result of introducing standards. But some key things might be, for example, do you want to spend more time on quality assurance activity on, for example, needs assessments? How do you know how good you are at identifying learners' initial needs early enough on in the programme? And are those actual assessments being used to develop a really robust, rigorous, strong learning plan for that particular learner? What areas of risk have you identified, and how are you mitigating against these in terms of your QA approach? So right in the centre of their sampling strategy, very focused in framework world on internal quality assurance and verification of portfolios. If you remove that qualification, as you can do in customer service practitioner and specialist, what actually happens to your sample strategy? What are you actually sampling? So there may be an activity there that you might want to look at around how you then extend that sample strategy across the learner journey, or themed reviews. So it could be doing a themed review on how well do learners progress, or how effective are we at identifying learners' needs. What activities are also now we're placing more emphasis on, and I think because you have 12 months minimum or 15 months minimum, then what you have is a situation where that is quite a significant amount of time to really dedicate on teaching and learning. So it's no surprise to say, if I was to answer that question in terms of where was the extra emphasis, I would certainly say in a customer service world, it's teaching and training and actually assessment, you know, it is still prevalent, it's still there, it's teaching, learning and assessment, but certainly making sure that we are developing learners' skills and knowledge. We have the dedicated time to do that without really getting wrapped up in summative assessment of qualifications. And then also, in addition to this, other considerations may be, how does this impact on the quality team or the IQAs? And we often hear, as we've worked with teams in support programs, we often hear people say, well, there won't be a role for me, as I won't be doing any assessment anymore because there's no qualification as part of these two standards. Or how will we know if an apprentice is making progress if there's not a qualification to track units? Or there isn't a need for my role as an IQA anymore because we've decided as an organisation we're going to aim to deliver customer service without qualifications. And I think that it's probably fair to say that when you look at the in-year data for Ofsted, where you've got 93 providers who've been given a specific apprenticeship inspection grade, there's a staggering 41% of either inadequate or requires improvement. So actually, in answer to the question around what will you do with your quality teams and IQAs, I think it's even more important to have a rigorous internal quality assurance mechanism in place. And it's even more important, especially if you do decide to remove the scaffolding of a qualification and start to understand and get to grips with, how do you know how good you are at developing the apprentice's skills, knowledge and behaviours? And if you can answer that question and embed that in your self-assessment, then you essentially are able to then develop and improve. So internal quality assurance in its widest sense, as opposed to internal quality assurance in the awarding body qualifications, verification, sampling sense and practice. So some top tips for reviewing your quality arrangements. Be clear about the activities you want to invest your time in. What we mean by that specifically is about making sure you have key quality indicators that you can start to manage by exception. You can look at key quality indicators and you can identify the areas of extreme where you need to go and take a deep dive to establish maybe if there's failing provision, or on the opposite side, if there's provision in areas for customer service that's doing really well, you can take a deep dive, find out what's really good about that provision and actually share that best practice. So review your vision for quality, set a wide range of key quality indicators, set and monitor and drive targets for quality improvement, review your internal quality assurance job descriptions, review your capacity and capability of your current IQAs. So potentially you may have a team of IQAs who only focus on verification of assessment practice. And actually, in the wider sense, if you're wanting them to reach out into wider parts of the learner journey, is there some CPD that needs to be done? And then also consider how best to assure that apprentices are being challenged to meet those higher grades. So within your quality assurance mechanism, it's really worthwhile looking to see how you actually determine whether your curriculum is challenging learners enough. And how do you capture that? Do you do it by observation? Do you do it by learner interviews, employer interviews? How are you actually going to determine how good you are at that? And then review how you assure how well apprentices are being prepared for endpoint. So for all that summative assessment is in endpoint assessment responsibility. Actually, what you need to do is make sure you have a really robust quality assurance arrangement so that you know that when you do send people to endpoint, when learners to endpoint, that actually they are ready and you've got confidence in your systems that they are ready to achieve the best possible grade that they are capable of. So just to reflect on some suppose, nuggets of information from Chris Jones, who's an Ofsted HMI. He's a specialist advisor for apprenticeships for Ofsted, and this is some of the things that have come out of an interview that has been taken place with him. So progress. So basically, is learning happening, especially in the absence of qualifications? Is learning happening? In terms of this, I think it's fair to say that Ofsted aren't going to audit at 20%, but certainly if they find that learners' skills aren't being developed sufficiently enough, Ofsted, I think, will dig to establish exactly the value that a provider is bringing to the table. Apprentices must get feedback, which helps them know how to improve. Formative assessment needs to be developed and focused. Focus on the skills, knowledge and behaviours of the standard. Focus on maths and English. We know that Ofsted have a concern, around the level 2 pass element. So as I said before, in customer service practitioner, the learner has to achieve a level 1 maths and English. They have to at least sit the test and experience learning that stretches them to the level 2 test, but they don't necessarily have to pass that test to get to Gateway. There are some concerns around that, which is essentially, if a test isn't worth passing, then really is it, the question has got to be, is it worth taking? But nevertheless, that is government policy. So just make sure that when you look at this, that you're able to disaggregate your data to really understand those learners that would have been capable of achieving that level 2 against those that were starting at such a low level that they would have never have reached it. So it's about understanding the starting point and being able to articulate that to external organisations that come to scrutinise your work. Employers being involved in delivery, so inspecting the whole apprenticeship. So it's really good to consider, I suppose, how Ofsted will view this. Looking at ensuring the contracts and support and commitment statements isn't just a paper exercise, that employers are consulted and they are part of the negotiation of what is being delivered in terms of teaching and learning. And where the employer isn't holding up their end of the deal, that there's clear records where the provider has challenged. And also business development roles is really going to be crucial in ensuring that the starting point is set correctly. And this can go back to reflecting on making sure that when we actually start apprentices on customer service specialist or practitioner standards, actually that they are in that true customer service role, and that standard is fit for purpose for them. Obviously, timely completion. We know that the timely completion now, in terms of success rates for standards, is not included. However, do you understand essentially at what point that learner is expected to reach Gateway, and in terms of looking at that, analysing how many of your learners are actually reaching Gateway point at the time in which they are supposed to be. And really that comes back to monitoring and measuring progress, making sure that the quality of initial assessment is right, the quality of reviews are right, the necessary action is taken where learners start falling behind, to make sure that they are fast-tracked to get back on track. And then grading of endpoints. So how are you going to use the grade boundaries to stretch and challenge your learners? How is it informing discussion with learners? And, should the final grade be a surprise? I would say, actually it shouldn't. If you've got really robust systems in place in terms of assessment, then essentially you should really be able to accurately predict how that particular learner or group of learners is going to perform in assessment. So I'm just going to move over to some questions, and I know that Zoe had a few questions for me.
Hi, Carol.
Hi.
Yeah, that's a really deep dive there into that sector. It's really
Thank you.
A couple of questions that we've had with regards to obviously some of the provision that we've done before. These are the key things that have come out from some of the providers. Do you have any examples of how providers have helped their apprentices prepare for the endpoint assessment?
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty mixed picture, really, or it has been as we've been working with providers over the months, and quite often providers have said they've started to embed the assessment method right from the beginning. So some have actually, built the curriculum and started to build in PD observation right from early doors. Some, as I've said earlier in the presentation, have decided to continue to actually get the learners to practice those assessment methods, but brought in maybe a third person in the last few months of the course just to apply that level of independence. And I know there are organisations that potentially have used their IQAs for that particular activity. Also, just continuing to carry out the assessment to ensure that you have a clear idea of how the apprentice is performing against the skills, knowledge and behaviours. So constantly, referring and going back to that. So I think it's practice, 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 really, without the fear of teaching to test. I think that's the danger. We really need to make sure that, as an analogy, when you go on a driving test, if you take the same route all of the time, and 5 out of 10 times, the learners, being able to follow that route, and then they go out with somebody different, and instead of turning right, they're asked to turn left and don't know what to do. So I think it's really important that they keep their skills, knowledge and behaviours right at the heart of the preparation, because that's what you want them to be able to confidently do.
Excellent. Another question is, can they deliver a qualification as part of?
Well, they can. So yes, employers who choose to have the qualifications embedded as part of the programme, that they can do, but there are a few funding rules around that. So because there's no mandated qualification, you really must check to make sure that what can and can't be funded. For example, non-mandated, registration, certification, examinations aren't funded under the rules, so the employer would have to pay the 100% cost for that.
So that would need to be negotiated separately.
It would, yeah. And I think the qualification itself, has to be relevant. It's got to be clearly relevant to the customer service standard.
Okay. And is it the provider that chooses the EPAO? What role do they have in?
It's actually the employer's choice. That's the ultimate goal. The employer now, as part of the reforms, has the choice to decide who they contract with. But I think it's probably fair to say that many FE providers are having to educate their employers about what choices they actually do have. Because let's face it, a lot of employers, wouldn't know which endpoint assessment organisations to choose from. So I think that, training providers still have a job to do in terms of, sharing that information with them.
Yeah, because obviously each of them may offer different support.
They may.
And all of that kind of thing.
And I always say quite often, it's a great time to go shopping, is what I say. We've worked with awarding organisations, and you've got providers that maybe have had long-standing relationships with awarding organisations. And I think the providers that really do well by giving this advice and guidance to employers are those that maybe have spoken to a number of endpoint assessment organisations and understand the offers that each of those EPAOs can provide, and share that with their employers so they can make an informed choice.
Especially within these, these sectors where there is that level of choice, such as customer service.
Of course, yes. 14, and I'm sure that will grow.
Absolutely. So again, from a competitive point of view, the support packages that will be around that will obviously be
vast.
Competitive.
Yeah, will be absolutely vast. Okay. Is there any more questions? Sorry.
No, that's it.
Brilliant. So just for the purposes of closing the session, what we have a couple of slides showing some useful links there to the resources. Some of them we've referenced today, for example, the provider toolkit. So there are a couple of slides there, and essentially really pleased to have had the opportunity to do the session today. And thank you very much for listening. That's my contact details, carol@strategicdevelopmentnetwork.co.uk. If you want to get in touch with me, please do so. Be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.